I'm Jerry Garfinkel, and I want to welcome everyone to the Jewish Studies Center class on the Jewish roots of Mike Nichols' movie, The Graduate. And I'm doing double duty, excuse me a little bit. I'm letting people in and also speaking to all of you. So I am, besides being Jerry Garfinkel, I'm the treasurer of this Jewish Studies Center. And as treasurer, I need to tell you that Beverly and our other instructors are all very talented and interesting. Classes are often very, very well appreciated, but we do have expenses. And since our classes are all free, we really appreciate donations. So if you go to our website and click on donate, you can donate or contribute via PayPal or credit card, or you can send us a check. And if you say you want to send the check, they'll give you the address. Okay, so now a few technical points. As most of you notice, this is being recorded. And after the sessions are over, I will post the recording on YouTube and then send an email to everyone who's registered, so you will know where the recording is, and you or your friends can watch it. One other thing is that we do have the live transcript or closed captions enabled. So if you're hard of hearing or you can't understand me or one of the other speakers, you can just click on what it says live transcript, and you can actually read what people are saying. Remember though, the live transcript may not be completely accurate. You might get some weird spellings somewhere, sometimes with it. Okay, the other thing is everyone right now should be muted, and you can't unmute yourself, but we do want your questions and your comments. So please write questions and comments in the chat box. Address it to everyone. That way, at the end of Beverly's presentation, Jerry Stilkin will consolidate some of the questions and ask to Beverly. I think that's about it for my technical points. I will not introduce Beverly, but Jerry Stilkin, who is a member of my synagogue and is a retired journalist, will be introducing the speaker for today, and he'll also later on run the Q&A. So Jerry, take it over. You are muted, Jerry. You're still muted. Okay.
And
you're okay now.
Okay. Now I think. Well, okay. Good evening, folks. Just as Beverly was finishing her doctorate in contemporary American fiction at UCLA, she said she surprised people she knew as well as herself by going to work for B-movie legend Roger Corman at Down and Dirty New World Pictures. There she edited scripts, did publicity, cast voice actors, did some production work. She left that company after several years to do some work in which she was properly trained, teaching, particularly Jewish American literature and culture. She began at the Los Angeles branch of Hebrew Union College with courses for rabbinical students and on the wealth and immigrant fiction by Jewish American authors. She went back to work for Roger Corman and his films, while also reporting on the entertainment industry for The Hollywood Reporter and as education editor at the Jewish Journal of Greater Los Angeles. She now writes and has for 11 years a twice-weekly blog, Beverly in Movie Land. She's written 3 books, most recently Seduced by Mrs. Robinson, How the Graduate Became the Touchstone of a Generation. Tonight, she will drill down from the smash 1967 movie starring Dustin Hoffman and Anne Bancroft to its Jewish roots and how that changed Hollywood. As the other Jerry mentioned, please put your questions in the chat box and I'll ask them on your behalf of Barbara. So please welcome Beverly Gray to the Jewish Studies Center. Beverly?
Good evening, everyone. There I am.
Here you are.
Yes. Welcome to everybody. My name is not Barbara, it is Beverly, and I'm really, really happy to be here tonight. What I'm going to do is start just a little bit reading from the beginning of the book, partly to remind you of the film, The Graduate, which I'm guessing you haven't seen in the last week or two, and partly to give you a sense of my very personal take on the film, a film which meant a lot to me back in 1967 and means a lot to me now. Anyway, here goes. There's this party. A young man, impeccably groomed, descends a staircase in a nouveau riche Beverly Hills home. He's instantly accosted by a bevy of squealing suburbanites, tricked out in sequins, feathers, and pearls. Liquor is flowing, tongues are wagging. Everyone is keen to congratulate Benjamin Braddock on the honors he's racked up at East Coast College. And what's next for the prodigy? Out by the swimming pool, one no bullshit businessman with a twinkle in his eye insists he's got the answer, and that, of course, is plastics. But there's also a woman with all-knowing dark eyes who peels away from the others of her generation. She gives Ben a once-over, flicks her cigarette ash, and asks for a ride home. She's proposing a party of another sort. That's how this graduate comes to get a very different education in a film that plays off adulthood against youth, pragmatism against idealism, lust against love, cocktails for two against a connubial champagne toast. The Braddock homecoming soiree is where it all begins, only to end, of course, when Benjamin turns wedding crasher, disrupts a young woman's nuptials, and runs off with the bride, which puts a real damper on the wedding reception. Now, the whole world showed up at that party. The Graduate was intended as a small, sexy comedy based on an obscure novel by a first-time author. But when it hit theaters in late December of 1967, moviegoers instantly took notice. Young people clapped and cheered. Their elders flocked to see for themselves what their offspring found so provocative. And soon intellectuals and religious leaders and even politicians were weighing in, trying to use The Graduate as a key to understanding those unruly post-World War II children who are now coming of age in such large numbers. And I was one of them, a baby boomer with a lot on my mind. When The Graduate first touched down in Los Angeles, I was a college student at UCLA. Longing to broaden my horizons, I had cajoled my family into letting me spend my junior year at a small college outside of Tokyo, which I believe it was called International Christian University. But when I returned in the early fall of 1967 to the land of the smoggy palm, I re-entered the realm of my parents. Proud of my academic achievements, they hovered over me, intent on helping to shape the future of their Shana Madel. Did I really want to earn a PhD in English? Had I thought about law school? And shouldn't I focus on the possibility of getting married? No wonder The Graduate struck a chord. Once I'd moved back to my pink childhood bedroom with its stuffed animals and a little sister too close for comfort, I paid rapt attention to the galvanizing movies coming to town. Anything, frankly, to get out of the house. The turbulent year 1967 turned out to be a high watermark for new American cinema, for films that took a hard look at the nation of my birth. Who could forget Cool Hand Luke, In Cold Blood. Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde, with its exquisitely calibrated take on violence American style, seemed particularly timely and particularly dazzling. Nonetheless, I hardly saw myself as the natural heir to outlaws like Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. But The Graduate was another matter. That polite young high achiever, those loving but, smothering parents, those comfortable but slightly bland surroundings, they combined to form an only slightly exaggerated version of my cozy West LA world. Yes, we even had a swimming pool. Hey, wasn't that me up there on the screen? Okay, The Graduate debuted in 1967, as I said, in December of that year, a time of great social upheaval. For those of us who were young people then, we remembered a lot of really bad things: a presidential assassination, a civil rights movement that started out hopeful but turned bloody, the ramping up of the Vietnam War. It made a huge impact on young people of high school and college age. And the film, as I said, went on to be discussed by pundits, by politicians, by clergymen who denounced it from the pulpit. It wasn't only Jews who paid attention, I must say. Young Catholics, for example, were very excited about those final images of Benjamin Braddock in a church brandishing a crucifix while beating back his enemies of the elder generation. So there's nothing at all explicitly Jewish about this film, but it somehow, at least to me, feels Jewish. And the question is why? To answer that question, I want to go back, first of all, to the novel, The Graduate by Charles Webb, published in 1962. It contains some of those scenes you remember. Ben in scuba gear at the bottom of his parents' swimming pool, Ben and a bride in full regalia at the back of a city bus. It was published, actually in 1963, by a young man, 23 years old, from Southern California named Charles Webb. His father was a successful Pasadena cardiologist, and young Charles went to fancy schools, including a boarding school in Los Olivos, and on to Williams College, all of them firmly WASP environments. Now, Charles Webb wasn't exactly a mainstream guy. In fact, he was a major eccentric. I can't get into all of that right now, but amongst the odd and curious things he did was refusing the inheritance his father left for him on the grounds that he didn't want the money, and then selling back the wedding gifts he and his bride received to the givers because he didn't want those things around his house. He was definitely not Jewish, but those who made the film were. The first one I want to mention right now was Lawrence Terman, Larry Terman, a producer still alive and kicking in his 90s, the recently retired head of the Peter Stark producing program at USC. He grew up in LA with his father in the schmata business. He worked for a literary agency and then on to becoming a young producer. In his mid-30s, he found this novel. He found it through a review in the New York Times, not a very prominent review and not exactly a fabulous review, but a review that sounded really interesting, and a review that compared the character in this novel, Benjamin Braddock, to Holden Caulfield. Now, everyone in Hollywood would love to make a movie of course, the story of Holden Caulfield, which is J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. And J.D. Salinger, who had no use for Hollywood whatsoever, has made it absolutely ironclad that nobody's going to get their hands on that book for movie purposes. But anything that was compared that seemed to have some of the same thrusts as the confused and adolescent and somehow lovable Holden Caulfield, that was of interest. So Terman strongly identified with his character and with Holden, and had the good sense to invite Mike Nichols to make this movie. Mike Nichols at the time had never made a movie. He was famous, of course, in the 1960s as part of a comic duo with Elaine May, and I assume you remember some of their work, a work that's just spilling over with Jewish humor and jokes about Jewish mothers, et cetera, et cetera. But the comic duo had split up, and casting about for something else to do, Mike Nichols was invited to direct a play. The play was by a young playwright named Neil Simon, and it was Barefoot in the Park, starring Elizabeth Ashley and Robert Redford. And of course, it was a smash hit. It made all of their names. Mike Nichols loved the material. He too identified with Benjamin and with Holden Caulfield, and he too wanted to be involved. Now, if you're wondering, this didn't end up being the first movie that Mike Nichols ever directed, because out of the blue, he was asked by Elizabeth Taylor to direct her and Richard Burton in the film adaptation of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. So that was his first outing as a movie director, as it turns out. But The Graduate was his first really elaborate, largish cast movie, and it was the movie that won him an Oscar for Best Director. The financier of the movie was a guy named Joseph E. Levine, a very interesting character. He was not part of the studio system in any way, shape, or form, because no studio wanted to touch this material. Joe Levine was brought up in poverty in Boston. His father died, his stepfather was a tailor, and because of the blended family, there were 13 kids in the house, and everybody was starving. If you've ever seen a picture of Joseph E. Levine, he is no longer starving. He's one of these guys who's much wider than he is tall. And he explained his girth by saying that in his youth, he never got enough to eat. Well, he made the money, he got enough to eat. He became a brilliant exhibitor of film and a film marketer. One of his great coups was Hercules Unchained, starring Steve Reeves, bearing his chest and fighting off lions. But he also imported European art films like the Sophia Loren film Two Women. So he could do classy things as well, especially if people took their clothes off in those fancy films. The writer of the film was a man named Buck Henry. We lost him fairly recently, I'm sorry to say. He originally was Henry Zuckerman. His father, curiously enough, was an Air Force general who went on to become a stockbroker. And his mother was a Max Sennett bathing beauty. So not exactly the classic Jewish background, but he had it. He was Los Angeles born, but educated in the East in prep schools like Choate and then Ivy League schools like Dartmouth. He looked like a preppy, but a preppy with a very sardonic sense of humor. And if you don't know what he looks like, you might remember him as the desk clerk in The Graduate. It's a small role, but a wonderful one. And he too, as I said, strongly identified, strongly felt that they understood that they were Benjamin Braddock. Now, when I spoke to Larry Terman about the participation of so many Jewish people on the making of this film, he said, well, The Graduate is a quintessential WASP movie. And I think he was talking about the subject matter, the novel, the environment, but it doesn't feel like a WASP movie to me. And I don't know that it feels like a WASP movie to Mike Nichols, who would have answered differently right on the spot. And as he did years later when asked, and said, my unconscious was making this movie. It took me years before I got what I had been doing all along, that I was turning Benjamin into a Jew. I didn't get it until I saw this hilarious issue of Mad Magazine after the movie came out, in which the caricature of Dustin says to the caricature of Elizabeth Wilson, Mom, how come I'm Jewish and you and Dad aren't? And by the way, I've tried finding that copy of Mad Magazine and never succeeded. But obviously, when we think of Jewish aspects of The Graduate, we do think of the casting, and that's what I'm going to go into now. Now, Buck Henry, who was certainly a witty fellow, saw, this is how he talked about the casting. He said that the original plan was to cast what he called surfboards. And by that, he meant California types, big, blonde, athletic looking. In other words, Robert Redford, Candace Bergen, and Doris Day. And all of those people were in one way or another considered. Robert Redford read for the role, Candace Bergen read for the role of Elaine. Doris Day, believe it or not, was a kind of original choice as someone who might be a very interesting Mrs. Robinson. It didn't happen. In fact, she never even read the script, but she was someone they thought of first because casting against type seemed awfully interesting. But these big blonde Californians looked a little bit the way Charles Webb, the original author, looked. Preppy, blonde, athletic. And again, being witty and a little silly, Buck Henry explains. He says, there was a genetic thing that happens. I don't know how it happens, and I think science should investigate it. That the darkest and most exotic Jews moved to Southern California, and in 1 or 2 generations, all the children are blonde and tall and blue-eyed. How does that happen? Well, sand gets in the genes. He told that to Terry Gross on Fresh Air, by the way, if you want to look it up. He quipped that when they had to rationalize casting Dustin Hoffman, who was not the obvious choice, they figured it's a genetic displacement. It's the other way around. He's a throwback to previous generations. So he's kind of the Jew who got away. Now, what really happened in the casting? There's lots of legends, and I'll tell you some of them. At first, and this is truth, not just legend, Robert Redford was favored by both Nichols and Turman as their Benjamin. And it made sense. As I said, he was tall and blonde. He looked like what the character in the movie apparently is supposed to be like, someone who's graduated from school with all the honors you can imagine, with student body offices, with being the editor of the paper, with being star of the track team, all the Letterman letters and all the accolades. So Nichols, remember, had just worked with Robert Redford on the very successful Barefoot in the Park. Redford was intelligent, Redford was talented, Redford was definitely good looking and something of a box office draw a little bit. But it didn't stop there, obviously. And the classic story, and this is myth, is that Redford said, you know, why are you dragging this out? Why don't you just go ahead and cast me? You know I'm right for the part. And Nichols said, I don't know, Bob. When was the last time you struck out with a girl? And at which point Redford said, what do you mean? That's a good story. It's not really what happened. What really happened was explained to me by Larry Turman, is that he had his doubts all along a little bit about, was Robert Redford really right for this comedy? He said, The Graduate only works and is funny if it's 21-year-old going on 16 who's sexually insecure. And Robert Redford did not fit that particular bill. But he was screen tested. Several actors were given a full day's worth of testing, a kind of a long composite scene with the Elaine character, Candice Bergen or whoever. And among those actors was Tony Bill, who did several interesting roles and then went on to be a very successful producer. There was Charles Grodden, who was Jewish, who in fact came from an Orthodox family, and curiously enough, insisted throughout his life that he actually was cast and for some reason turned down the role. He insists that that happened. Larry Turman insists it did not happen. But he was one of those people in the mix, and Dustin Hoffman was another. Now, let me tell you about Dustin Hoffman. He was, of course, legendarily not 21 years old like Benjamin Braddock. He was 30. He was born in 1937. He grew up in LA, profoundly self-conscious about his looks, his height, his ethnicity, everything about himself, really. But he was still determined to be an actor, although a lot of people thought he was nuts. He went off to Broadway, to New York, excuse me, where, curiously enough, he was a great pal of some other people who became very, very successful, Robert Duvall and Gene Hackman. They were roommates at one time. But he was starting to make his way, not on Broadway, but in the off-Broadway and off-Broadway and off-Broadway kinds of roles. Roles that called upon his comfort with playing odd characters, strange characters, people who had a hunchback, people who had an accent, people who were transvestites and wore a dress. Those were the kind of roles he gravitated toward, the weird ones. But Mike Nichols had seen him at an audition and thought, well, maybe. So he came in to read the script and he saw the name Benjamin Braddock and said later, right away, I'm in trouble. Benjamin Braddock, he just didn't see himself as a Benjamin Braddock. And in tape interviews, he seems genuinely convinced that the novel described Ben as 6 feet tall and blonde with blue eyes. He says, it says it right there in the book. Actually, it doesn't. There are no descriptions in the book. It's part of the artiness of the way that Charles Webb wrote it. But he did the audition, didn't think much of it, and wasn't really sure this is the kind of thing he wanted to do, a romantic comedy in which he played a leading man. He said, I'm supposed to be where I belong. An ethnic actor is supposed to be in ethnic New York, in an ethnic off-Broadway show. You know, I know my place. He said that reading for the role as he did on that one-day screen test opposite Catherine Ross, he was just really, really verklempt, as one says. He says it was like a Jewish nightmare. So he wasn't sure he wanted the part at all. And curiously enough, something else was brewing. In fact, Mel Brooks was thinking about him while casting one of his first films, The Producers, in which he had Dustin Hoffman in mind to play the Nazi playwright. So instead of actually snuggling in bed with Mel Brooks' actual real life Anne Bancroft. But in any case, he didn't think he did well on the audition, and he didn't think he was right for the part. And he said that to Nichols, who said, don't worry, maybe Benjamin Braddock is Jewish inside. Now that's a really interesting remark. And Nichols expanded on this, was asked about this years later, and said that Buck has always said that Benjamin's a walking surfboard, and that's what he was in the book, in the original conception. But I kept looking and looking for an actor until I found Dustin, who's the opposite, who's a short, dark, Jewish, anomalous presence, which is how I experienced myself. That's an interesting comment, which leads me to tell you something about Mike Nichols. I was surprised years ago when I found out that Mike Nichols, despite his sort of white bread name and kind of blondish looks, was definitely Jewish and not American born at all. That he was born in 1931 in Berlin, a member of a very literary Jewish family. His maternal grandfather, for one, was the German Jewish anarchist and intellectual Gustav Landauer, who in 1919 was murdered by German counter-revolutionaries for some of his ideas, and was buried in a grave that was later desecrated by the Nazis. So it wasn't great to be him at that particular point in time. He's a little boy. He's in what's becoming Nazi Germany. His father had a Russian background, was a doctor, and was able to leave for the US, which he did in late 1938, leaving behind his wife, who was ill, and 2 little boys. The elder of the 2, and this is the one who was going to become Mike Nichols, is Michael Igor Peshkovsky, and he had a brother who was a couple of years younger. And the 2 of them, just the 2 boys, got on a ship for New York in early 1939. And somehow his mother managed to get out and came to the US in 1941. And I have not yet figured out how she managed that. But even while leaving on this boat, under the supervision of a steward there, but basically alone, the boys' climb up that gangplank was delayed by a broadcast of Der Führer speaking over a loudspeaker with everybody standing at attention until that harangue was over. So it was as if Hitler was following them to America. At that time, the young boy who was going to become Mike Nichols only knew 2 sentences in his new language. One was, I don't speak English. And one was, don't kiss me. They got without incident to New York, where their father picked them up. And one of his first glimpses of New York City was seeing Yiddish and Hebrew writing on some signs, maybe in the Lower East Side. And he said to his father, "I thought that wasn't allowed." And his father said, "It is here." So obviously his life was improved and maybe saved by coming to America. But it was also, for a 7-year-old boy, a time of a great sense of loss. Think about it, he's 7 years old. He's lost his homeland, he's lost his language, he's lost his name, because fairly quickly his new name became, he took on the new name of his father, Nichols, and became Mike Nichols. He's lost all those things. And this is a kid who at age 4, from a faulty whooping cough vaccine, has permanently lost all his body hair. So if you can imagine what Mike Nichols looks like in your memory, seeing old Nichols in May routines or whatever, that's not his hair. He's wore wigs through the rest of his life. So this was a kid who was bearing up with a lot. At first there was some money. Briefly, he was at a ritzy New York City private school where, curiously, Buck Henry was a young classmate. And thinking back, remembered Igor, as he was then called, as careless and with a heavy accent. Again, not a good look. And then, having lost all those things, he lost his father when he was 12. So Mike Nichols, deeply ingrained in him, was a sense of himself as a permanent outsider. And he brought this conception to Benjamin Braddock, who ironically, in the original novel, was the golden boy, the guy who had everything. But somehow Mike Nichols focused on what he didn't have, what his sense of loss, his sense of confusion, his sense of being excluded. Nichols had a very interesting conversation late in his life with Abigail Pogrebin in a book called Stars of David, Prominent Jews Talk About Being Jewish. And he referred there to a story by Thomas Mann called Tonio Kruger. It took place in Germany 100 years ago, as he said, and was about the blonde, blue-eyed people and the dark people. The dark people were the artists and the outcasts, and the blonde, blue-eyed people were at the heart of the group and were the desired objects. And this is the way that Mike Nichols saw the world, saw Benjamin as one of those dark people outside of the mainstream. Even though everyone's congratulating him and patting him on the back and saying how wonderful he is, in his own mind, he doesn't fit. He's someone different and therefore has to go a different way. All right, so to his surprise, to everyone's surprise, Dustin Hoffman is cast in the leading role of this film. Everybody, the crew reacted, press reacted, everybody thought this was very strange. And even up to the point where the film was being shown at industry screenings, people were coming up to Larry Terman and saying, well, that's a great movie, but it's just too bad you miscast the lead. He was referred to over and over again as ugly. There was a profile of Dustin Hoffman, and it should have been a really big deal, building up his personality before the film opened, letting the world know who he was. Profile was written by a man named David Zeitlin for, as I said, Life magazine, the magazine that pretty much everyone had on their coffee table. It called him a homely non-hero. And the title of the article was "A Swarthy Pinocchio Makes a Wooden Roll Real." And it started like this: if Dustin Hoffman's face were his fortune, he'd be committed to a life of poverty, with a schnoz that looks like a directional signal, with skittish black beady eyes and a raggedy hair cap. He stands a slight 5'6", weighs a mere 134 pounds, and slouches like a puppet dangling from a string. Not to be outdone, in Time magazine's review of The Graduate, they described him as such. The hair is from a thatched roof in Cambodia, the nose and chin from a 1948 Chevrolet, the hooded eyes from a stuffed hawk. Even the voice seems assembled, an oboe with a post-nasal drip. Hoffman didn't exactly enjoy those descriptions of his physical being. He saw in them a kind of disguised anti-Semitism. He says, they would describe me the way that the cartoons in Nazi Germany in the 30s pictured Jews: beak-nosed, squinty-eyed, nasal, Remember, he was born in 1937, so he was around for some of that talk of the Nazis, and it was very, very uncomfortable with it. But after the release of the film, reviewers quickly, some of them anyway, picked up on a Jewish quality of Hoffman in the film. Various reviews called him a schlub, a schlep, though not a schlemiel, a Jewish boy with Gentile parents. Renata Adler in the New York Times called him, quote, a shy, inhibited intellectual, probably Jewish, who has never played on any sports team in his life. The joke was that everyone may have been skeptical, but young America fell in love with Dustin Hoffman. They wanted to be like him. They wanted to be with him. There's a very charming book called Crying at Movies. It's a memoir by a writer named John Mandarino, in which he describes himself in his college years as being approached by a young woman slightly older than he was and definitely better looking, saying, I want to go out with you. You look like Dustin Hoffman. He didn't consider this flattering because, in his words, Dustin Hoffman looked something like a rodent. But if this young lady was interested in him, it was good enough for him. In the next chapter, they're in bed together. So looking like Dustin Hoffman obviously had its advantages in that era. Now, we know that in Hollywood history, Hollywood was mostly found by Jewish immigrant bosses who were desperate to fit into the Gentile mainstream. Harry Cohn of Columbia Truth is reputed to have said, the only Jews in my movies play Indians. There were, of course, Jewish actors, we know that, and some of them even played leading man roles, but they were people who changed their names and concealed their identities. We know the names, John Garfield, Kirk Douglas, Tony Curtis. But a funny thing happened after The Graduate. People started looking differently at the way they were making casting choices, leading to what the critic Jay Hoberman calls the Jew wave, where mainstream Jewish characters playing roles that in some cases are specifically specified as Jewish roles in various kinds of romantic films. And among the names, I'm sure you know of them, Elliot Gould, Richard Benjamin, films like Goodbye Columbus, Richard Dreyfuss in The Goodbye Girl. He won an Oscar. He beat Richard Burton that year. Charles Grodden, who finally got his break with The Heartbreak Kid. And also we saw a rise of other ethnic types who really hadn't been around in the same way before. Robert De Niro, Al Pacino. So in recent years, this change, this in public opinion, has led to new potential for a Ben Stiller or for a Seth Rogen to be, from time to time, Hollywood romantic leading men. I have to add that this doesn't mean that the doors were wide open for Jewish women. Yes, there was Barbra Streisand, but nobody else quite fit into that same box. And Sarah Silverman lately has been crusading to recognize the fact that even the Jewish roles, like the role of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the role of Deborah Lipstadt, are going to non-Jews, who are people played by actresses who are not Jewish and they're English to boot. Wait, excuse me, I'm just suddenly realizing Deborah Lipstadt was played by Rachel Weisz, who is Jewish. But who is Ben Stiller canoodling with in Meet the Parents? Why, with a pretty blonde played by Terry Polo, and that's usually the way it goes. We've got the ethnic Jewish young men and the blonde girlfriends. Within Hollywood, actors were certainly seeing this change in casting standards. And one of the most fascinating reactions that I'm aware of is that of a classic Hollywood hunk. You've heard of him, Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen was certainly a good-looking fellow, but was less secure than you might think. This is recounted by his wife, Neil, in her memoirs, that after he saw Dustin Hoffman's performance, he said, God, baby, I can't believe this guy's going to be a movie star, can you? I mean, he was one ugly cat. Good actor, yeah, but he sure is homely. And he brooded on the possibility of people like himself, people like Paul Newman, maybe be supplanted by this new batch of ethnic newcomers. And as Neil writes in her memoir, Steve would stare at his image in the mirror and say to me, "Look at that, baby. Take a look at that face and that body and tell me the truth. Who would you pick, Dustin Hoffman or me?" We would both laugh, but I knew he was serious. I'm going to throw out a few things now, and then we could break for questions about, it's the most speculative part of my talk, but I'd like to hear other people's opinions. Thinking about The Graduate and how it was made and what was in the minds of the makers and the minds of the viewers, it certainly is, among other things, a New Yorker's mixed feelings about Southern California, which Nichols referred to at times as a poisoned paradise. And Nichols always said he was trying to resist in this film the Los Angelesization of American life, and you East Coasters might agree with that feeling. It also, I think, reflects a Jew's mixed feelings about materialism. I mean, remember, it was Tevye who said, "It's no disgrace to be poor, but no great honor either." It's about family dynamics that, to me at least, feel very Jewish. Ben's parents love him and they want the best for him. Believe me, as I've gotten older, I pay more attention to the parents in the film and less to the sexual affair with Mrs. Robinson. They're good people, but they're smothering him with their love. They give him things. They give him a fancy Alfa Romeo. They gave him scuba gear as an expression of their love. It's an intense family bond. Notice at that opening homecoming party, no young people anywhere in sight. So I think of a Jewish Benjamin Braddock's parents as being originally from the East, maybe from New York. Certainly the actor playing his father definitely sounds like a New Yorker. They probably are the children of immigrants themselves. They went through the Depression, they went through World War II, maybe they got the GI Bill. They've achieved material success. What they want for their son? They want him to have even more than they have, and without the struggles they went through. They're proud that he's achieving in an area, in this case, academics, the Ivy League or the fancy college, that was not open to them. He's weary of all this togetherness and he's tired of gratitude. Believe me, I know that feeling. When I talked to Dustin Hoffman, I was not able to talk to him very long, but I was able to ask him a question that meant a lot to me. Why is it that this movie, rather than just being a hit of the moment, why is it still around? Why do we still know it? Why do people still watch it? And he gave me a very curious answer. He said, because it's about parents who are the children who are shaped by the Depression. Instead of love, they give things. And I'm not sure that explains why the film is so popular, but I think it explains a lot about Dustin Hoffman, who had an uneasy relationship with his own parents. Instead of love, they gave things. I also feel that the film, for me, seems to reflect what I think of as the nice Jewish boy who was always polite, never found it easy to be a rebel or an activist, but who was moving into a period in time where activism is what's happening. He's always liked making people proud, but he's now overwhelmed by the obligation to do this. A person like, for example, Todd Gitlin, who was the president of SDS, if you remember, the Students for a Democratic Society, the Jewish son of two teachers who went to Harvard, eventually became a historian, wrote a very important book on the 60s called Years of Hope, Days of Rage. He acknowledged in the opening of that book how he personally had to cross a boundary to be rid of his caution and politeness and to move on to what he wanted to do in the world. So my sense is that in The Graduate, Dustin Hoffman's Jewish soul merged with Mike Nichols' outsider credentials to create a character in whom American Jews of the post-World War II era could see themselves. And some of those who identified with Benjamin Braddock, and an awful lot of people did, some of them turned into the angry radicals who fought against that era's status quo and fought against the ongoing Vietnam War. I'm thinking, for example, of the rebels who shut down 5 buildings at Columbia University in April 1968, then in many cases snuck out from behind their own barricades to see The Graduate for the umpteenth time. Yes, it was still in theaters for a good 6 months after it opened. One of these student rebels at Columbia later told Mike Nichols that when Ben and Elaine escaped from the church and climbed on that bus, that was what the strike was all about. Those kids had the nerve. They felt a necessity to break the rules. Now, not every student radical is a fan of The Graduate. Another person I talked to at some length was Mark Rudd, who was infamously the leader of that rebellion at Columbia and went on to be part of the Weather Underground. He was impressed with movies like Bonnie and Clyde, real shoot 'em ups featuring true radicals, but not The Graduate. He said of Benjamin Braddock, "Here's an alienated kid who graduated and didn't know what he was doing." Well, we weren't alienated anymore. We were beyond alienation. Mark Rudd is right. In his sexual and romantic defiance of the older generation, Dustin Hoffman's Benjamin Braddock was hardly making an explicit political or social statement. He was basically thinking of himself, his own needs, his own desires. But his outrageous screen antics do hint at what happens when a nice Jewish boy throws caution to the winds. Before I finish, I want to give you a very interesting piece of trivia. I'm wondering if anyone out there knows who owns the copyright of the novel, The Graduate. Let me explain that after the success of the film, Charles Webb didn't make a whole lot of money on the original sale of his book. But after the success of the film, you can imagine, the paperback version of the novel, which of course had the tie-in to the film, sold millions and millions of copies and made lots of money for a man, Charles Webb, who didn't particularly, in fact, who rejected the idea of making money. And so after a time, he and his wife, Fred, and that's another story, gave the copyright to the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, and that's where it is to this day. He said, "Though neither Fred nor I are Jewish, we gave the rights to the ADL because we felt they had influenced us in a profound way to understand prejudice in all of its forms and victims." So if you buy a copy of The Graduate, you're helping the ADL, and that's not a bad thing to do. I'm happy to entertain questions.
Jerry, you are muted. Can you unmute?
No.
You are unmuted now.
Okay, thank you. Beverly, I saw the film back then, and I don't recall feeling that there was some Jewishness about it, but I did think that Dustin Hoffman looked kind of Jewish. Now, I couldn't tell you why that's so. I don't look at noses and eyes that much, but that's what I did feel about him personally. So I suppose I'm not I'm not unbelieving of the notion that there's something Jewish about the film. Have you, Beverly, have some opinion about the looks of Dustin Hoffman himself?
As to opinion, I mean, we all know that it's not fair or right to judge people by their looks, but we all know that we do that constantly. And we all know that certain people stand out as being a representative. Certainly in the bad sense, those kinds of stereotypes were prominent, certainly happened in Nazi Germany, but we do it too. Today, what you look like is very important, as I'm not going into the whole issue of representation and diversity and all that, but what you look like is extremely important. And Dustin Hoffman certainly grew up thinking that he was very, very Jewish in his looks, that this was embarrassing to him. He was constantly bothered by it. It's something he did his best to escape, but he knew that it was fundamentally a part of him.
One question being asked is, do you think Simon and Garfunkel's music had anything to do with the Jewish flavor of the music? Of course, the references to Jesus Christ might not jive with Jewishness, but in any case, what do you think about the music to the film?
Well, like a lot of things, I think it's incidental. They definitely are Jewish, and you'd have to dig to find a kind of a Jewish soulfulness in the music. But the music was very important to the success of the film and to the whole mood of the film. I should add, I think it's interesting that when they started out, Simon and Garfunkel were given by their record label the name Tom and Jerry because it was felt that their actual names were too Jewish. So I don't think they set out to write Jewish music, but somewhere in their essence, perhaps, there's a spillover. And I should say that this is how the music got used. Mike Nichols had received from his brother the album Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme. And he found himself playing it as he got ready every morning to go to the set. Now, you know, film music is usually about the last thing you add. So Nichols was kind of used to thinking in terms of those songs, those sort of mournful, sad, young songs. And he found himself thinking about the songs, particularly in some of those interludes in the movie. He said he was going to hire Paul Simon to write some new songs for them. So Simon, who was a very busy guy, he was very popular at that point, didn't come up with much. He came up with one song, I believe, which Nichols didn't like. But they had meanwhile been cutting, particularly there's a long interlude in the film where there's no dialogue whatsoever. It's just Ben going back and forth between the family swimming pool and Mrs. Robinson's bed. They were cutting it to Simon and Garfunkel music, and they decided it fits, we want it, this is what we need, The Sound of Silence in particular. And at first Joseph Levine said, wait a minute, you can't do that. You can't put in all those old songs, everyone will laugh at you. Those old songs being about 2-3 years old, but you know, it was considered important at that time to have original music. They said, no, we want these songs. And it turned out to revolutionize, in a way, the film music industry, because everybody heard the songs. They came into the theater with those songs in their head already. The songs awakened memories and associations. And suddenly everybody is using old music in their films to capture certain times and places and moods. So I can't really say whether the music is Jewish, but I can say that the music is very important.
Would you say that for many of the young people of the 60s, the late 60s, that some may have fastened onto or thought about the Jewishness possibly of Benjamin Braddock, but for most people, young people, is it your opinion that it's the breaking of this, hey, it's your graduation, let's give you everything, and you will love all of these material items, etc. Would you have some notion of which of these two, the Jewishness or the anti-materialism, came to the fore? I mean, although you can, of course, have both.
Exactly. Well, you know, the millions and millions of young people, not just in this country, but around the world. This movie was a hit in Japan. This movie was a hit in Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think most of them were seeing the materialism and the sense that their parents, of course, didn't understand them, but that their parents didn't understand them in an era where they felt particularly stranded. And certainly in this country, they felt particularly at sea. And I think it's important to point out it wasn't just the Jewish identification. And I do keep running into people who say, yeah, when I saw that, I thought that was Jewish because I'm Jewish, I understand it in a Jewish light. But I had a very interesting series of conversation with someone who is a Christian brother. I don't quite understand it, but it's someone who's not a priest, but is like a priest who has really given his life to the Catholic Church, but who saw this movie as a young Christian brother teaching in a religious school, who saw it as the young people of his own faith rising up. There was an awful lot of seeing whatever you wanted to see in this movie. In fact, it's been said, and I think it was said really well by someone in Newsweek who said, Benjamin, in a way, you know, what's his problem? In a way, he's kind of a blank slate and you can put on him anything that you're feeling. So, you know, these Catholics, this fellow that I was speaking to, he saw it in a very Catholic community where the kids were just going crazy in the theater. They loved this movie so much because it was their form of rebellion. And, you know, they fastened on the church scenes and the swinging the big gold cross around. That's where they saw the movie. So it's going to be seen differently by different people.
One question asked that says that the movie, the ending, is he considered ambiguous, ambivalent? Perhaps there's a kind of warning about the 60s, or at least the notion of what we think of the 60s, because the questioner thinks that it makes you think they're not going to be together very long. It's all kind of patched together, this relationship, this marriage, and that therefore everything is hurried and everything is somewhat confused. Does that strike any bell with you?
Oh, it's fun to talk about the ending of this movie because, again, Mike Nichols said later, this was the ending my unconsciousness made. This is what happened. They were supposed to get on the bus. They were supposed to be happy and ecstatic, and there were some lines that were cut. So they were just supposed to look happy, and that was supposed to be the end of the film. So the two young actors are on the bus, and it so happened that this was filmed at the end of the shooting period. You know, when you make movies, that doesn't always happen, but it was the end, and they were tired. So they were trying to look happy and exuberant and overjoyed, and they were also a little intimidated by Mike Nichols, particularly since he was snapping at them that day and was really being tough on them. And so you could see the hesitation in them in response to, they waited for the scene to be ended, for someone to say cut, no one did. And they were trying to figure out as actors what they should be doing. So they were trying to look happy and excited, and then they would look a little nervous, and then they would look around, and then they would try again to look just ecstatic, out of their minds with joy, and it wasn't working. And when Mike Nichols saw all of that in the editing room, he said, "This is my ending. I didn't know what I was doing, but I guess I did." That he wanted that ambivalence. Now, Larry Terman, on the other hand, said that they had a little disagreement where Mike thought that this couple was doomed, that there was no way they were going to have a happily ever after, and that it was naive to expect that. And Larry said, no, that the youth of America are going to clap their hands with glee and say, yes, this is it. And some people felt one way, some people felt another. Some people felt one way and then over time changed their minds. There's a lot going on in that ending.
Mm.
And of course, they've made quite a joke out of the idea of a sequel to The Graduate. It's in a movie called The Player, where Buck Henry comes on and is pitching a sequel, what happens to Ben and Elaine in the future. But in point of fact, there was never a plan to make that sequel. There is a sequel to the novel made years and years later, and it's terrible.
Terrible. Well, I guess some things end well, and don't try and stretch it too far.
Yes, exactly.
Some people have seen the film much as you describe it as the rebellion of a materialist society, an iconic feature of the 1960s, the rejection of all the riches. And others think that they see a little bit more in the oral history of Mike Nichols. Did he do an autobiography at any point?
No, he did a lot of talking, and there is a biography out in the last, after my book came out, but there is a full biography that was written with his cooperation. So if you want to know what he was thinking, but certainly
Right.
Anti-materialism was part of it. Oh, somebody I know had a note about plastics, and of course, that was one of Buck Henry's additions to the screenplay.
Yeah.
And of course, it stood in for everything that was crass and commercial, financially inspired and plastic about the adult world. But years later, years after the film came out, a reporter from Time magazine went to a convention of plastic manufacturers and said, how did this film affect you? And people said to him, one and all, we loved the movie. And in fact, some of them said, when I saw that movie, Ben may not have wanted to go into plastics, but to me, it sounded like an interesting possibility. And I headed in that direction immediately. So for them, it was an encouragement to take up something that was new, lucrative, and available.
I think that scene, and certainly the word plastics, is probably what has most remained in my mind since seeing the film. Plastics as the sort of epitome of what you don't want to do, something you don't want to get into. It's just money. The
actor who played that, who had that one-line role, that was his proudest moment of his entire career, is getting to say that word.
Someone noted that Buck Henry was also creator of the TV show Get Smart, among other achievements.
Co-creator with Mel Brooks, and he always felt a little bit kicked under the bus, that he didn't get the attention for that he felt he deserved. But he had several other career aspects that were interesting, and one of them was that he was a spokesman for, let me see, Society for Prevention for Clothing. It was an organization founded to say that animals should wear clothes. And it was tongue in cheek, but it was played very straight. And Buck Henry was very good at playing things. At that point, he wasn't known. So he would have been on, you know, Walter Cronkite or someone being interviewed about why animals should wear clothing. So he was kind of a merry prankster. And despite, you know, the horn rimmed glasses and the very serious look, he had a lot of fun.
Now, you mentioned working for B-grade movie producer, director. Would you tell us just, you know, quickly, you know, what is a B-grade movie? And then why don't you tell us about the book, the wonderful book you wrote about B movies?
Okay, thanks. Roger Corman was sometimes called in Hollywood the king of the Bs. It's a title he never liked because B movies mean several different things. It originally meant in the old studio system, when you had double features, there was the A movie that would be with the bigger stars and the bigger budgets. And then there'd be the B movie that would be kind of produced by the same studio, but with less fancy stars and less elaborate costumes and less effort. And so that was what a B movie was. It was the lesser movie. It was like the B side of a record. If I'm really dating myself, I suppose. But B movies came to be called, when I first worked for Roger, which was in the early 70s, were called exploitation films. And that started to have a bad connotation after a while. But they were movies that he and others were making starting in the late 50s, early 60s for the teen crowd, the drive-ins, movies your parents didn't want you to see, things with monsters, things with werewolves, things with, you know, the supernatural and a lot of blood and guts. Roger, as a director, was famous for making movies based on the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, starring Vincent Price. And then in the years when I worked on him, and I worked on about 170 movies, there were every kind of movie you can imagine. We made stripper movies, we made whatever was popular at the time. We even made family movies at times, just whatever was hot. We made, in order for it to come out before Jurassic Park, we made something called Carnosaur. The title of that book is Roger Corman, Blood-Sucking Vampires, Flesh-Eating Cockroaches, and Driller Killers. And I'm very proud of it. It's an independent biography, talked to an awful lot of Corman people. Some are famous, some are not, but the man's as interesting as his movies, perhaps more so. And I am happy to recommend it as the author.
Just something that comes around to bite you. Someone noted that PBS NewsHour reported tonight the UN is requiring action platform against all our plastics being used, that is, end the plastics that are not recyclable by 2024. So maybe it's, so a lot of people made money on it, but let's hope for not too much longer. Jerry, is it getting about time to wind up? If so, Beverly, do you want to say something in closing?
It's been a pleasure talking to you. I wish I could see, I see some faces. I wish I could see all of them. Some people I'm privileged to know and I'm grateful they're here. A lot of people I don't know and would be glad to get to know. If you're interested in reading my books, I urge you to do that. I also, as has been said, write Beverly in Movie Land twice a week, every week, on movies, movie making, and growing up Hollywood adjacent. I urge you to, it doesn't take long to read, 600 words. And I love the movies. I love talking about them. And I would love to chat about movies with anyone who would like to do it.
Well,
Thank you. That becomes clear.
given your great presentation now, I'm sure the blog would be very interesting also. And I will put information about the blog and books and other things on our website, and some of it in the email that I'll send out when the recording is ready. But I will take the privilege, not the white privilege, but the hosting privilege, say a couple comments. Some people like myself are not really up on contemporary music. So when I watched the movie, I thought all the music was brand new, and I loved the music. That was one of the reasons I loved the Graduate altogether. I mean, the fact that, you know, Art Garfunkel was actually a college mate of mine, that wasn't part of it, but just that Simon and Garfunkel songs were just so wonderful. I really like that. But I do have one complaint.
Okay.
About not the movie, about you though, because you're making me want to watch the movie again. I'm going to have to take some time and watch The Graduate again. I haven't watched it for years. So,
well, one of my favorite reviews of the book was one which said, "You may think you know this movie, but read the book and then watch it again, and you'll find there are things that you never thought about." So it's a good combination, a book and a movie. What could be better?
yeah, I agree. I mean, what I tend to do, especially on these movies which are sort of based on reality, I watch the movie and then I read about it. So, oh, that's what happened. That's why that happened. Anyway, I appreciate. I think a lot of people here will appreciate. Besides putting the recording up and an email about it, I'll probably also include the chat box, because there are a lot of interesting things in the chat box, including a reference to a interview on the Forward Jewish newspaper with you a few years ago. There'd be lots of things of that sort. Now let me also thank Jerry for doing his first real job of interviewing and Q&A and stuff. We're trying to get him into this type of business. And let me tell people that we have other classes tomorrow at the same time at 8 o'clock. We're having the fourth and last session of the class, Per Vote, Pathways to Life, which is very different from The Graduate. That's about Per Vote, the wisdom of the fathers. And then next week, not at this time, but at this day, Wednesday at 7 o'clock, we have usually our biggest annual program, the Max Tickton Memorial Latka Hamantaschen debate. Are Latkas better? Are Hamantaschen better? You have to watch to see what the result is. And then a week from tomorrow, we're having a beginning of another 4-series movie about Jewish text, about the Mishnah Berachot, about how our ancestors discussed prayer. And it'll be very interesting. And he says there's some very juicy parts to it. I don't know what juicy parts there will be, but that's the promise of it. So again, thank you very much, Beverly. I was a little concerned that you weren't going to use a PowerPoint, but it was very interesting. You did a great job. And thank you, Jerry, and thank all the people who asked questions and who came, et cetera, et cetera. You will get an email from me in a day or two when I get the film with the recording recorded, and I'll give you a link.
Great.
So that's it for today, and I hope to see some of you tomorrow and then next week at the Latka Hamantaschen debate.
Thanks so much. Goodbye to everyone. It was a pleasure to be here.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.
That too.